Hello, I'm Paul Marchbanks, and this is Digging in the Dirt, with the first in a series on the films of Danish filmmaker Lars von Trier, and a few of his cinematic antecedents, those who preceded and heavily influenced him. Today we will begin with Carl Dreyer's Vampyr from 1932. On the same dark and stormy night that spawned Mary Shelley's tale about Frankenstein and the creature he knits together from corpses, we also find the birth of a novella entitled The Vampyr. John William Polidori's short fiction codified for an English-speaking audience many narrative features that would later become essentials in vampire lore. Seductions that spill into acts of assault, wounds to the throat that leave a victim dead or dying, and a mysterious assailant adept at hiding his or her monstrosity from a rather bewildered public. The vampire remained an unequivocal threat in J.S. Le Fanu's very eerie Carmilla, Bram Stoker's duller but more well-known Dracula, and to a large degree Richard Matheson's apocalyptic I Am Legend. With the exception of notable anomalies like Penny Dreadful, more recent serial takes on vampires usually complicate the vampire menace. Buffy the Vampire Slayer, True Blood, and Twilight all suggest that some creatures of the night don't really enjoy the bloodletting required to stay alive. A few apparently have hearts of gold. Today's vampires become lovers as often as they become murderers. Carl Dreyer's Vampyr, then, is quite a jolt to the 21st century mind, defeating our expectations of a sexy, brooding love interest as likely to kiss as to carve holes in willing prey. Vampyr's central antagonist, Marguerite Chopin, is an unregenerate villain whose minions do her evil bidding without question, and whose diabolical actions as one of the undead apparently mirror the evil she accomplished while still alive. The film also disrupts our expectations by refusing to hand us an easy-to-follow storyline. Though Dreyer's film cobbles together ideas and incidents from clearly plotted Gothic fictions by Le Fanu, it does not adhere to the linear paths marked out by its source material, instead presenting us with an impressionistic collage of images and incidents that require active engagement from the viewer in order to piece them together. You can't just sit back and passively absorb this tale as easily as, say, F.W. Murnau's Nosferatu or Todd Browning's Dracula, because Vampyr keeps presenting you with questions. Why is no one working the front desk at the inn where our hero, Alan Gray, arrives in the opening scene? Why is he carrying fishing gear if he's intent on seeking out supernatural phenomena? Can we trust that everything Alan Gray sees and hears has an independent reality outside of his own perception of it? How is it that the shadow world, inhabited by some of our characters' spirits, appears capable of impacting the tangible world? Under what conditions was Leone, the eldest daughter at the local manor, first attacked? Are those under the thrall of Marguerite Chopin vampires themselves? Does Alan Gray almost die at one point in the film, or is he never really in jeopardy? Are his repeated visits to the manor driven solely by curiosity and altruism, or is there an understated love story at work here? The film will keep you on your toes, just as producing and bringing it to theaters kept Dreyer on his. Those familiar with his body of work know that many of his films took years to create and market, helping to explain the decade that elapses between later films like Day of Wrath, The Word, and Gertrude. Vampyr was no different. When funding proved elusive, Dreyer found a European aristocrat named Nicholas de Gunsberg who agreed to back the film as long as he could star in it. Neither he nor most of the other cast members had any acting experience. Many were selected because they could speak all three languages in which this early talkie was scripted: German, French, and English. Arguably, however, Dreyer uses them all, including the more experienced actors who play Leon and Leon's father, to great effect. See if you agree. Another challenge lay in the film's distribution schedule. Though finished in Paris in 1931, the film sat on the shelves for 9 months before premiering in Berlin on May 6, 1932. The distributors decided to wait till well after the premieres of Universal's competing monster films, Dracula, released in 1931 on February 14th, and Frankenstein, released the same year later on November 21st, before releasing Dreyer's own attempt at a genre film. The director was, shall we say, not pleased. Dreyer's true goal, however, never was finding a large audience. Like Lars von Trier, a Danish auteur who followed and was heavily influenced by him, Dreyer concerned himself first and foremost with fidelity to his singular vision. In an interview conducted in 1987, von Trier describes his, quote, almost holy relationship with his predecessor, identifying in Dreyer's work, quote, an honesty that I haven't seen in any other films. 8 years later, von Trier elaborates, quote, I think that he's a very honest director. He never made anything in a calculated fashion. He always, so to speak, went against what was in vogue. Von Trier, in other words, considered Dreyer a rebel like himself, one unwilling to pander to public tastes to win box office receipts. Dreyer's films shaped his cinematic era from the very beginning. Trier bought an old 16mm projector when still a teenager, obtained a few strips of film from a family friend, including a documentary about cockroaches and the trial scene from Dreyer's The Passion of Joan of Arc, and wove the footage together at a time when he knew nothing about Dreyer. We can only guess at the final product's pacing and structure, but one thing is clear to those who know Trier's later work. This early bit of creative editing signaled a lasting commitment to combining dissimilar stylistic and thematic components, to creating tension the audience must work to resolve. It also signaled his conviction that truth and beauty appear strongest when juxtaposed against suffering. In Trier's hands, the unwavering faith of the young French mystic in Dreyer's film comes into relief against not only the spiteful accusers caught by Dreyer's close-ups, but alongside images of insects associated with horror and decay. The connections between the two filmmakers grew following film school, once the aspiring director had cheekily added the nobiliary particle von to his name and had begun making the feature films that comprise his Europa trilogy. Von Trier has praised Dreyer's films as, quote, extremely beautiful and impressive stylizations without much effort at realistic psychological acting. The same could be said of von Trier's first two films, The Element of Crime and Epidemic, films made at a time when von Trier remained more interested in image than in story. The Element of Crime also echoes Vampyr by following an inquisitive protagonist determined to unpack a mystery, a hero whose perspicacity the viewer cannot fully trust and whose intervention endangers both himself and others. In Epidemic, von Trier intentionally replicates lighting choices made in Dreyer's The Word and Gertrude by employing multiple small light sources to subdivide his own sets into similarly discrete zones of illumination and shadow. He also decides to hypnotize one of his actors in this film, having learned that Dreyer did the same while producing The Passion of Joan of Arc and Gertrude. And he makes hypnosis into both a plot device and a trope in his next film, Europa. While creating this trilogy, von Trier also directed an adaptation of Euripides' Greek play Medea from an unproduced script by Dreyer. Though he deviates from Dreyer's intentions in making the tale's infamous infanticide far worse than Euripides' original, he hews closely to Dreyer's design in most respects. Most importantly, to my mind, von Trier shares Dreyer's preoccupation with metaphysics. Though Trier grew up an atheist, A pattern of spiritual inquiry has always informed his films, an interest signaled in the sporadically blasphemous epidemic as much as the journey to hell dramatized in The House That Jack Built. Soon after his film Breaking the Waves won the Grand Prix Award at the 1996 Cannes Film Festival, an interviewer questioned the credibility of the unlooked-for miracle in this, von Trier's most overtly devotional film, comparing it to the supposedly equally untenable miracle in Dreyer's The Word, or Ordet. Von Trier's response was swift and unequivocal. Quote, "It's credible enough. It's about taking the miracle seriously. Dreyer's unproduced film about Jesus was supposed to end with the crucifixion," von Trier continues, "but he stressed that he wouldn't mind having it end with the resurrection, that is, the miracle. It was just more practical to end with the crucifixion. As a general rule," von Trier argues, "Dreyer goes for the miracle." As we move through the series on Lars von Trier's films and their antecedents, I encourage you to consider whether the same is true of von Trier's own work. Which most frequently wins out, the darkness or the light?